All right, week 8 forum. Here we go. As with last week, this is going to be a very long little mini lecture. Let's talk a little bit about Chapter 13, which deals primarily again with domestic policy. Let's talk a little bit about fiscal policy. The federal government has a mandate to tax and spend to promote the general welfare. Uh, but what constitutes the general welfare is deeply controversial. I'll mention a particular federal subsidy, Pell Grants. How many of you are eligible for Pell Grants? Don't raise your hand. What exactly is a Pell Grant? Pell Grants were named after Democratic Senator Claiborne Pell, who added a provision to the Higher Education Act of 1965 that provides federal funds to students who can demonstrate needs. These are grants, in other words. They don't have to be repaid. So why does the federal government subsidize access to college for low-income students? The reason is that research demonstrates that a college education is one of the surest pathways into the middle class. Once again, this is an area over which there's considerable disagreement, as with what we talked about last week. Democrats want to expand the subsidies. Republicans generally think that paying for college is a matter of personal responsibility. You can feel free to weigh in on either side. Chapter 13 also addresses other kinds of economic policy, efforts by the government to ensure that the monetary supply and the overall value of the currency remains stable. Now, economics is a very complicated discipline, and it generates a lot of counterintuitive insights into how people behave in the pursuit of money and other valuable goods. So things can get complicated. And I'm going to try to give you a broad idea about the government's role in the economy. And yes, it does have a role. Economic policy is an important dimension of public policy because a government's failure to ensure consistency in the value of money can introduce instability into the economy and can impede investment. And that creates enormous incentives for corruption. Because a lot of economic behavior runs contrary to what common sense might otherwise dictate, it's really important for the government to get economic policy right. So, what can the government do to ensure that the value of the dollar doesn't depreciate? In other words, lose value. This is the realm of monetary policy. So what is the chief institution responsible for implementing monetary policy? That would be the Federal Reserve Board, which is a mix of public and private banking institutions that act as the central banking institution for the federal government. And what is a central bank? That is basically a reserve institution that controls the availability of money. It's kind of like a damming system, which we're dealing with a lot of rain right now, right? If there's too much rain, you get a flood, and floods are bad. The central bank's job is to try and keep the flow of money stable and steady, right? To use a metaphor, the Fed controls the spigot, right? How much water, how much money is going out into the economy. And they do that by raising and lowering interest rates that the Reserve's regional banks extend to other banks. When interest rates are high on the banks, they raise rates on people that want to borrow money. So who wants to buy a car when the interest rate is at 18%? Now, on the other hand, when interest rates are low, there's significantly greater incentive for bankers to extend credit. So the Fed is in a position to anticipate economic performance and ensure that the economy maintains a stable and steady growth. The point of monetary policy is to avoid extremes. If the economy is growing too fast, then there's a risk of inflation, which can lead to a recession or a contraction of the economy. As the price of goods rise rapidly and the supply of goods declines, right? So you want to try and avoid those kinds of situations. The Fed tries to ensure an evenly functioning economy by tracking economic growth and raising interest rates when the economy appears to be running too hot, and lowering interest rates when the economy actually is in recession and needs a boost. So that's the 10-cent lecture on monetary policy. Let me offer you a history lesson to illustrate how complicated this can be. In the 1970s, the U.S. economy entered a phase that no industrialized economy had really experienced. The economy was shrinking, but prices remained high, and there was persistently high unemployment. Economists created a new concept to describe the situation: stagflation. What caused it? Why was it such a persistent problem? What policies did the Federal Reserve undertake to combat stagflation? Another issue that Chapter 13 addresses is welfare. For you students, what do you think when you hear the word welfare? What do you think it means? Why is the federal government, through federal subsidies and in the states and everything else, why is the government involved in combating poverty? The case for using the government as a means of reducing the worst consequences of poverty are that many people who find themselves poor didn't earn that status, right? They didn't fritter away their wealth or deliberately decline to work for a living. Rather, they were born into poverty or lost work due to the malfunctioning of the economy, or they simply were born into an economically depressed, area. Welfare has its origins in the workings of the modern economy. Previously, work was predominantly agricultural in nature, and communities and families were generally in a position to deal with the consequences of a bad growing season. Industrialization changes the relationship between individuals in the community. The scale of industrialization means that there's more money, and it's not necessarily being equitably distributed. And that creates the volatility that can lead to recessions and even depressions, which is another way of saying prolonged periods of poor economic performance. So welfare has a political dimension as well. The modern origins of welfare can be found in modern Germany, where the newly established German state confronted a well-organized labor movement that was right on the cusp of becoming radicalized and prone to revolutionary passions. Otto von Bismarck, the first German chancellor, responded to the potential threat of trade unions by offering German workers welfare, providing workers better pay, more reasonable hours, access to health care, and the like. Those sorts of policies weaned the German working class away from socialists preaching revolution like Karl Marx, and effectively brought them into German politics. They had skin in the game, and they had a reason to believe that the German state was not unalterably opposed to workers, and the whole idea of a decent living. The same thing happened shortly thereafter in England, but it didn't happen in the United States until well into the 20th centuries. So what are the primary programs of the American welfare state? There are three at the federal level that take up about half of all federal spending: Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Social Security is a social insurance program whose intent is to reduce poverty among the elderly. It's essentially an intergenerational system of enforced savings. If you work consistently over the course of your adult life, you'll be paying into the Social Security Trust Fund. When you hit a designated age, these days I think it's 67 or 68, you apply to receive your benefits, and you get monthly payments for which you pay annual income tax. It's an elegant program. Money comes into the trust fund, and money is sent out, monthly. There are some economists, within the Social Security Administration who periodically calculate something known as a COLA adjustment, which is otherwise known as a cost of living adjustment. And that gives you slightly more money than you would have gotten otherwise. People who earn a modest income over their working lives benefit considerably from Social Security. Wealthier Americans benefit less. So, Social Security is in fact what we call a redistributive program. The poor benefit more, the wealthy benefit less. But they do benefit to some extent in the event that they actually take it. So hands up, how many of you think that Social Security won't be around for you to benefit from? The reality is that Social Security is a very sound program. The only reason it wouldn't be around for you to rely on would be, when you retire, would be that if somebody killed the program. In my opinion, Social Security is solvent and could be funded for another 300 years with some modest adjustments in how the program is funded and or how it dispenses its benefits. If anything, current recipients should be getting larger COLA adjustments, and that the wealthy should be paying more in Social Security taxes. Most Americans are not aware that there's a ceiling on payroll taxes, including FICA, which is a dedicated tax that goes into the Social Security Trust Fund. Americans only pay into Social Security on the first, I think, $115,000. Only around 19% of Americans earn more than $100,000 annually. But some Americans make that much in a month. Think of it this way. The head coaches for the Oklahoma Sooners and the OSU Cowboys don't pay Social Security taxes after January. I will pause and let that sink in. One of the most controversial aspects of the American welfare state is, again, health care, which includes access to affordable insurance. Medicare is one of the first major programs designed to ensure that elderly Americans have sustained access to health care. Medicare is, in fact, the most socialized aspect of American public policy. If you are a certain age, 65, you are eligible to use the Medicare system to help defray the cost of health care, which is always higher for the elderly. Like Social Security, most Americans pay into the Medicare system over the course of their working lives, but Medicare's dedicated taxes are much lower than Social Security. And as a consequence, the program is much more vulnerable and much less solvent. The Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, passed in 2010, was supposed to expand access to health insurance and improve the overall quality of insurance. The four principal elements of the ACA were the mandate, which basically meant you had to purchase some kind of insurance or pay what amounted to a tax. 2, healthcare exchanges, which were online marketplaces where individuals could purchase private insurance. 3, risk corridors, which were effectively subsidies to insurance companies designed to incentivize their offering insurance in what are, unhealthy states, which are low population states whose populations contain large proportions of poor, unhealthy people like us in Oklahoma. And 4, Medicaid expansion, which was essentially designed to make the ACA too good a deal for the states to pass on. So why is the ACA not working the way legislators intended? Well, first, Republicans rejected it. Not one Republican voted for it. They campaigned against it in 2010, 2012, 2014, and 2016, promising the voters all the way that they were going to repeal it and replace it with something better. What that better plan would look like, they really didn't say. Second, Republicans sabotaged the ACA at both the federal and state levels. At the state level, states controlled by Republicans like Oklahoma rejected Medicaid expansion, which hurt low-income people in those states. At the federal level, Republicans were eventually successful at killing the risk corridors, which caused the insurance companies to hike their premiums in order to ensure their profitability. So why is the ACA still around? Largely because Republicans, despite controlling both houses of Congress and the presidency until 2018, had been unable to kill it. Their plan to repeal and replace was wildly unpopular with Americans, and they ultimately couldn't get it through Congress. So, let me be clear. Governments have always subsidized access to health care. Without subsidies, only a handful of the very wealthy would be able to afford the attentions of a doctor or a surgeon. And there would be a lot fewer doctors and surgeons because the marketplace for such skills would be extremely limited. There would be little to no healthcare infrastructure, few hospitals or urgent care facilities. Most people would die far younger than they would than otherwise if they were able to get access to healthcare professionals. This really shouldn't be a liberal or conservative issue. There ought to be conservative solutions to this problem that don't involve denying millions of Americans access to care. If you hear of any conservative plans to fix healthcare, I would love to hear about it. In any event, I hope I've given you plenty to discuss and think about with Chapter 13. Let's move on to Chapter 14. We are dealing with the formulation and conduct of American foreign policy. It's a subject I happen to teach as a standalone course, so I'll try not to overwhelm you. The government conducts foreign policy with 3 principal aims: national defense, national security, and the betterment of the world, whatever that might mean to you. What does the federal government do to protect the nation's territory? Certainly part of the appeal of Donald Trump's presidential campaign was his promise to build a wall along the U.S.-Mexico border. He claims that a wall would secure our southern border. Quick question, does anyone think that building a wall is going to stop the movement of undocumented immigrants across our southern border? My opinion, I'll be happy to tell you if you ask. The federal government also has the responsibility for advancing the nation's economic interests as well. How does the government do that? Have you read about the efforts of the federal government to advance American interests abroad? That happens to be another area that Donald Trump has claimed the campaign that the previous administrations had made a series of bad deals with other countries and that he would renegotiate trade agreements like the North American Free Trade Agreement with Canada and Mexico, our two largest trading partners. Based on what you've learned, how are those efforts going? I mean, at this point, he has renegotiated NAFTA and renamed it, really. Trump has actually tied the wall to American prosperity, arguing during the campaign that he would build the wall and Mexico would pay for it. Is Mexico paying for our wall yet? There is also a third aspirational element to U.S. foreign policy. Americans have an obligation to try and make the world around us a better place. Previous presidents like Jimmy Carter have emphasized human rights as an element of U.S. foreign policy and have tried to pressure regimes that mistreat their citizens into respecting basic human rights. A significant element of U.S. tensions with Iran stem from the regime's potentially destabilizing actions in the Middle East, which is an incredibly important region that contains much of the world's proven oil reserves. Iran has sponsored terrorism, which means they train and arm non-governmental organizations like Hezbollah, which is a political organization that advances the aims of Shiite Muslims in Lebanon and Syria. I'll stop for a second. So does anyone know the difference between a Sunni and a Shiite Muslim? If not, we can take that up in the forum. Back to Iran. The U.S. and 5 other nations imposed very harsh economic sanctions on Iran in response to mounting evidence that the regime was engaged in an effort to develop nuclear weapons. That package included sanctions that were in place from 2006 to 2015, which included the ban of Iranian oil sales and a pretty thoroughgoing trade embargo. You can ask what a trade embargo is if you don't know. Those sanctions devastated the Iranian economy and gave the international community leverage to force Iran to stop its attempts to develop nuclear weapons. In 2015, the U.S., the United Kingdom, France, Russia, China, and Germany signed an agreement in which Iran promised to stop enriching uranium and agreed to periodic inspections of its nuclear facilities in exchange for a relaxation of the economic sanctions. The Trump administration pulled out of that deal, claiming that it didn't go far enough. So how would you evaluate the recent tensions that have gone on between the United States and Iran in light of Trump's decision to pull out of that deal? How has the United States' position in the world changed since, the founding of the country? I jokingly refer to the United States as a super duper power in my upper division classes, owing to our unprecedented wealth and the strength of our military. But the United States in 1787 was a fledgling nation with a huge debt and a non-existent military. When did the United States become an economic and militarily significant actor in global politics? Would you say we are gaining or losing power relative to the rest of the world right now? For much of U.S. history, the dominant attitude of Americans towards the world was expressed in the idea of isolationism. What was isolationism, and how did it impact the Americans' views of the outside world? How isolationist was America from 1787 to 1945? Is there a wellspring of isolationist sentiment within the United States culture to this day, waiting to be tapped? What would a return to isolationism mean for the United States and for the rest of the world? The text discusses new threats to U.S. security, which addresses the Bush administration's war on terror and the Bush Doctrine. What were the key elements of the war on terror? What did the Bush Doctrine say about the United States' willingness to resort to military action? How effective would you say the Bush and Obama administrations were in countering the threat of terrorist organizations like ISIS, Hezbollah, and Hamas? Um, One of the most important parts of Chapter 14 concerns the agencies responsible for conducting foreign policy. Who's responsible for implementing U.S. foreign policy? Journalists who specialize in foreign policy talk about the Golden Triangle, which refers to the White House, the Pentagon, and Foggy Bottom, which is the headquarters of the State Department. The presidency has a great deal of authority over how foreign policy is conducted, and foreign policy analysts note that presidents over the past 60 years have increasingly conducted what they describe as a White House-centered foreign policy, which means that presidents are conducting foreign policy directly using the National Security Council, which we talked about in Chapter 11. What does that mean that cabinet secretaries wield less influence than they did previously? Now, that has conferred a great deal of influence on the National Security Council staff and the National Security Advisor, who is appointed by the president and not subject to Senate confirmation. One of the most troubling issues with the Trump administration foreign policy team is that the first National Security Advisor was Michael Flynn, a retired general who had once headed the Defense Intelligence Agency and who was fired fairly early on for putatively lying to other administration officials about the nature of conversations that he'd had with Russian officials. There are larger questions about whether or not Flynn acted as a lobbyist for foreign governments. He has since pled guilty to lying to investigators. Trump's second NSA, H.R. McMaster, lasted barely more than a year before resigning. So Trump is already on his third national security advisor in less than, well, a little bit more than 2 years in office now. The two departments that still play a significant role in formulating and implementing foreign policy are the Defense and State Departments. The Secretaries of State and Defense retain tremendous influence because they manage the two most important nodes of foreign policy expertise and capacity. The State Department is primarily responsible for diplomacy, and so the Secretary of State is responsible for carrying out the president's foreign policy vision. Once again, right now the State Department is acting basically headless. They have, again, a temporary appointment since Rex Tillerson was fired, I think, last summer. At this point, I'm going to pause again and provide you guys with some context. The Secretary of State was historically the principal foreign policy conduit for the president. And in the 19th and 20th centuries, the Secretaries of State were essentially the primary foreign policy actors. Some presidents in that period didn't commit much attention to foreign policy because foreign policy just wasn't that important. That changed with the immediate aftermath of World War II for two reasons. First, the end of World War II saw the United States take on a much higher foreign policy profile, and presidents were compelled to commit more attention and energy to foreign policy. And second, the creation of the National Security Council provided presidents with a direct, basically, line to conducting foreign policy. All that said, Secretaries of State occupy a very sensitive position within the foreign policy community. They basically wear several hats. They are the chief diplomat. They are the public face of the federal government. They play an important role within the intelligence community. That makes the job of Secretary of State really difficult, and it's no small reason why several of the most recent Secretaries of State faced a great deal of controversy and criticism. Now, in contrast, the Defense Department is huge in terms of sheer size and scope of its responsibilities. The Defense Secretary and the civilian leadership in the Pentagon are responsible for formulating plans for defending the U.S. National security and their national interests over a variety of scenarios and in several regions that are considered sensitive to U.S. security interests. For example, if there's a problem with Muslim militants in Niger, which is a country in northern Africa that has huge deposits of uranium, then the military will have to formulate plans for dealing with that. What role does Congress play in the formulation and conduct of foreign policy? It would be easy to say that Congress plays second fiddle to the president, but Congress does have a role. The Senate in particular has that advice and consent power for major presidential appointments, and so have influence over presidential advisors and policymakers. The House likewise has appropriation authority, and Congress collectively exerts significant influence over the budget allotted for foreign affairs. Both the House and both houses of Congress also have oversight power and can use that power, as we're seeing today, to investigate, publicize, and or oppose the president's foreign policies. The last comment I'll make on Chapter 14 is the role that the public plays in foreign policy. As a rule, only a tiny segment of the public is both interested in and knowledgeable of foreign affairs. This is what political scientists describe as the attentive public. Americans generally only pay close attention to foreign affairs when there's a likelihood of conflict. But even then, the most Americans' attention span as it relates to foreign affairs is short. We should also note that the U.S. has been in a state of warfare on a relatively continuous basis since 2001. Are Americans getting war weary? Should the U.S. end its occupation of Afghanistan? What should we do? Okay, hopefully this video and the one on domestic policy will give you plenty to think about and to discuss. As always, if you have any questions, this is the place to get some answers. Finally, I hope you've enjoyed this course, and I hope you've learned a lot. And if you have any questions, or if you think that there's anything that I can do to make the class better, please don't hesitate to let me know.